How's it going? I didn't see you in class. You're in the pamphlets. Oh, I thought you were. Okay. Yeah. It's good, but Professor Theoharis says she's teaching capstone this semester. I don't like. I'm so jealous. How's your walk through application?
I mean, I've submitted them.
Thank you. I was just telling her that I feel like I have to push mine back. No. You're taking the November?
I can hear the echo because of my phone. I'm gonna. Yeah, that's right. What was that? Huh? They just need to speak into the mic. Go ahead, just say something. Say how you doing.
Hello, how are you doing?
Try again.
Hello?
Yeah, that's good. Wait, I need to do it again. Just all three mics. I'm gonna.
Hello?
I'm off your mic. That mic too? Oh, we tried the mic too? Yes, sir. We try it? Yeah, I can try it.
Hello?
That one, how about that one?
Hello?
Okay. Yes, because I do it one more time. Yeah, do that. I'm going to.
Oh, great. I'm Prof. Harris.
Nice to meet you.
How about now? Are you gonna echo? Or did you even hear what I just asked you?
I just mentioned, yeah, I didn't know that's fine. I know I just said the regular.
One, two, three. One, two, three. You're echo.
Yeah. Yeah. Did she volunteer there? Oh, did she? Oh, okay.
I'll reduce the volume a little and turn the phone or moving it away from. Can you hear me through the screen? Hello? Are you hearing me through the screen? Are you hearing me? And there's still echo? Yeah, I turned it down a little. You think I'm gonna turn it up?
Yeah,
A
we had
little
to be
more.
separate. And then whatever stuff you donate, because that's not. So remember my tell you about stuff. So right. So I
And really don't let you get it. Oh, he didn't hear echo the first time? Okay. Test 1, 2. Well, can you turn the volume a little bit again? When you first heard it back.
But it was only 3 of them.
And
I don't know, it's better. So I fixed those 3. It's really very, very good. So I fixed those 3. But notice, I don't know, maybe exactly. You didn't play for all
Oh.
numbers. Yeah, just like I was like a 4-digit number. And I'm thinking it might be the one where you get people for like that. But I have I don't think I would trust them.
Everyone, there's a 10-minute delay. Test one. Test 1, 2. Test. Test 1, 2. Test. Test 1, 2. Test. say this?
Did I request? Yes. I gave it to Gaston. I hope you approve.
I am, like, whatever, it's your show. I was just wondering, who is, it is nice, oh, then I have no objection to say this.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Prudence Cumberbatch. I'm the chair of the Department of Africana Studies. I am stepping in today for Professor Gaston Alonso, who is the director of the Wolf Institute. So my job today is to introduce the speakers, to welcome you, and I guess to make sure things keep going smoothly. So I just want to welcome you here today to this great conversation between Professor Theoharis and Professor Emeritus Barbara Winslow. And I want to call up Sal Fong, the director of the Women's Center, to say a few words and make a presentation.
Well, I didn't realize I didn't make a speech, and I think I just tell you a personal story with Barbara, and it's a homecoming for Barbara, and I know Barbara before I start at Brooklyn College, and so she's well known in the organizing community, believe it or not, and for a white person, she's actually
Not bad.
well, very good. This 100% love it, but she really well respected. So when I first started working at the Women's Center, when I got hired, Barbara was actually on the hiring committee, and so she's the mama of those who bring me in here, and she assured me she had no regrets, and so thank you, Barbara, for bringing me to the Brooklyn College. And so over the year, Barbara has been one of the most consistent and persistent supporter and participants in both the Women and Gender Studies program as well as the Women's Center. And now the folks that do not know the work that she has done, and and I think that Jeanne can talk about her work as this public internet, and I can talk about her support in here. She's a lot of times she's our cheerleader, she's our motivator, she's our anger translator, and she speaks when we cannot speak. So I cannot say nothing bad about Barbara. And she gave me a very good tips about retiring. That is, when you're ready to retire, make sure you can do what you want to do. And and I take it to heart. And Barbara, welcome back. And I hope that the flowers.
Oh, this is beautiful. Mwah. Thank you. I get to say a few things about you, too.
But today, George, I'm going to let Jeanne talk about.
So, thank you, Safon. Today's event is the fifth in a series we organized, the Wolf Institute to celebrate the publication of recent books by Brooklyn College faculty. At the door, you should have received a program with the upcoming events, and the Wolf Institute hopes you will join us in the future for those events. We have an exciting event coming up next shortly. That is the next Thursday. Melissa Murray from the NYU School of Law. She is also a legal analyst on MSNBC. Will be here to give a lecture on the Supreme Court's job decision, reproductive rights, and democracy. That will be next Thursday at 12:30. Right here in the Tanger Auditorium. Also, I want to let you know that this event is being live streamed and will be posted on the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. And lastly, if you didn't sign in on your way in, please sign in on your way out. I'm going to introduce the speakers now. First up is Professor Barbara Winslow. She was a professor at Brooklyn College from 1999 to 2013. 1996 to 2013. When I saw that, I was like, it's been a decade? Really? It doesn't seem like it's been that long. I feel like you were just here. She was the coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program for many years, as well as the coordinator of secondary social studies program for over a decade. a lifelong political activist, especially in the women's liberation and reproductive justice movements. She is also the author of Sylvia Pankhurst's Sexual Politics and Political Activism, reprinted by Winslow in 2022. Cleo in the Classroom, A Guide to Teaching U.S. History, Oxford University Press, 2009. Shirley Chisholm, Catalyst for Change, published by Westview Press in 2013. And the editor of Reshaping Women's History, Voices of Non-Traditional Women's Historians, University of Illinois Press, 2018. And her most recent work, Revolutionary Feminists, the Women's Liberation Movement in Seattle, Washington, 1965 to 1975, published by Duke University Press this year, 2023. We will also hear from Jeanne Theoharis, who is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College and is the author or co-author of 11 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Her widely acclaimed biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won the 2014 NAACP Image Award and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women's Historians. It also appeared on the New York Times bestseller list and has been adopted into an award-winning documentary directed by Johanna Hamilton and Yoruba Riken and executive produced by Soledad O'Brien for NBC Peacock. And if you haven't seen the documentary or read the book, I encourage you to do both. She also has a young adult version of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. It's an adaptation with Brandy Colbert. And she has other books like A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, which won the 2019 Brooklyn Public Library Prize in Nonfiction. And you can find her work all over in the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Slate, The Atlantic, Salon, The Intercept, The Chronicles of Higher Education. And she has a recent article in The Nation that I encourage you to take a look at. And so let us welcome our speakers today, and they can get started with their conversation.
Welcome back. Thank you. Do you want to start us off just with a little bit about the book? Yes. Great. The first question everybody asks at a book thing is, what got you interested in this book or the topic? But I first want to thank the Wolf Institute and Gaston, if you're watching. Hi, Professor Alonso. I was on his search committee as well, and I'm very glad that he's here. If by any chance Professor Fraser is watching, I'm sending a great deal of love. She couldn't make it today because of family issues. I want to also thank Professor Cumberbatch, who was an extraordinary, dynamic leader of the Women in Gender Studies program, transforming it in so many ways. I can't do enough shout outs for Safong Ao, I know you all by your first names, who has run an extraordinary women's center, and I hope all of you stay active in making sure this women's center is funded and supported. I'm going to say something about it when I talk. And of course, I'm really overwhelmed and thrilled to be speaking with you, Jeanne, and I hope you'll be kind. Anyway, this is a book about the Seattle women's liberation movement. And Seattle is 3,000 plus miles away from Brooklyn, and it may seem very different. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I lived in Seattle from 1967 to 1973. I was an undergraduate and graduate student at the University of Washington. I taught at the first women's studies class at Seattle Central Community College. I also taught a women's studies course at the University of Washington. I was active in the Seattle Central Community College American Federation of Teachers, was active, as we all were, in opposition to the U.S. imperialist war in Vietnam. I was active in supporting the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, fighting, and all the various things which I'll talk about, which have relevance for us here today at Brooklyn. And there was another reason I wanted to write this book, is aside from my activism in Seattle, is I have been very upset by the way in which the women's liberation movement has been presented. Now, I want to clarify some language. There's a difference between the women's movement, which is the more mainstream, and in our language of the 60s, bourgeois women's movement, characterized by the National Organization for Women, the National Abortion Rights Action League. This is not to denigrate them, but they were more mainstream. And women's liberation, the women's liberation movement, we were actively, unabashedly anti-capitalist. We were those of us who were white, or as Malcolm X would describe me, pinky green, anti-racist, anti-imperialist. And not only did we wanted more than women's rights. We wanted the total destruction of what we call the patriarchal state, the patriarchal system. So I'll try to be clear when I use this language. The women's liberation movement has been, as you would accept, mischaracterized by the right and hated by the right, you would expect them to, but also often by the left. That is, we were accused of being racist, assuming that we were all white, which we were not, that we were divisive, that we didn't care about children, we didn't care about housewives, we were just interested in hating men. And as I delved into the research, I sort of hope I answer a lot of this with factual information and with a sense of humor. Finally, as I started working on the book and started writing it, what I realized, and really now have come to really proselytize, the importance of local histories. So much that has been written about the women's liberation or the women's movement or any of the social protest movements have been written from far and above. But if you get and make assumptions about what went on that didn't exist. So, for example, the more I delved into the local readings, what I found out was in a city that was 94% white, which I'm sure none of us in Brooklyn can even imagine, 2% AAPI, 2% Latinx, 2% Indigenous, and 2% Black. I went to a university that had 35,000 students, only 150 were African American, and less than 100 were Latinx. We in Brooklyn, we can't imagine such a world, but that was the world that I looked at. But as I did my research, what I found was that Black women and Latinas played foundational and fundamental roles in founding the first women's liberation groups and in staying in the first women's liberation groups. They were active in our struggle for reproductive justice, in our struggle for daycare, in our struggle for women and gender studies, and so forth. This is not to say that the groups weren't overwhelmingly white. They were. And a lot of us, including me, exhibited racial cluelessness, indifference, and sometimes just outright, shockingly, not, Ku Klux Klan or Speaker of the House type racism, but racism nonetheless. But nonetheless, when you look at the local history, quite often you're very surprised at what you find. And so I say another reason I wrote this book is I hope it may inspire other scholars, and even some of you professors, to encourage your students to do some local history of Brooklyn. I would think it would be a fabulous book to write about the Brooklyn Women's Liberation Movement. We talk about the Women in Gender Studies program. It didn't start because the president of Brooklyn College thought it was a good idea. It did, and the Women's Center. It didn't start because the president or the administrators wanted it. It started because people like yourself fought, struggled, sat in, demonstrated, leafleted. There's even a great documentary about the struggles, for example, to set up the Puerto Rican and Latino. Is it still, or is it Latinx? Forgive my language. Sometimes I'm stuck in the past sometimes. And there's a great documentary about the struggle at City College. So understand that much of what we are learning today came about as a result of really terrific struggles by activists in the 1960s. And I know Jeanne knows a lot of this, but just in New York State, people say, oh, we're so blue. We've always been cobalt blue. When I was doing research for a book on Shirley Chisholm, I looked up the voting rights for New York State. And until 1960, in order to vote in New York State, you had to be proficient, you had to exhibit fluency in English, both writing and speaking, and you had to prove you had an 8th grade education. And worse, you had to go to the police station every year to register. Now, how many of you would like to go to a police station ever, let alone once a year to register to vote? And so you can see that New York State, far from being so liberal, had some as restrictive voting laws as many in the South. And I understand you're doing research on the civil rights movement or the about racism in the North, or
Yep.
so I can't wait. And maybe some of you professors will encourage your students to do some research. And we've got a lot of material on the Shirley Chisholm Project. And I can tell you in terms of local history, just developing the Shirley Chisholm Project of Brooklyn women's activism opened my eyes to so many struggles that went on here at Brooklyn College in terms of the struggles against racism, the struggle against war, and the struggle for a better and more inclusive education. So that's enough for right now.
All right. So, I mean, one of the exciting things about the book, and everyone should get it, and Barbara will be signing books, I think, afterwards, right? A few, is that you were both a kind of participant in some of these movements, and then you're also an historian. And one of the things that we know as historians is that there are things that when you're in something you can't see, that you can see differently once you. And so I wanted you to tell us about one or two of the most interesting things you found out as an historian that changed the way you saw something you'd been in.
Again, the question of race. I reflect on it in the book. And just to let you know, I came from a predominantly white suburb. There were African Americans who were in the suburb, but they mainly cleaned people's houses. Need I say more? I never in my entire life, from K through graduate education, had a professor, teacher of color. And as a graduate student, all my professors were white and male. So in a sense, I got a very racist education, formally racist education. And everything I learned about the Black struggle, about the women's liberation movement, about lesbian and gay, about movement, about internationalism and so forth, I had to learn in spite of and despite of the strictures of the academy. And we all thought we were pretty good, and we set up women's studies programs, and we thought we were terrific. So when I was doing research, I looked at the women's studies professors and offerings for the first 5 years. Jeanne knows this. There wasn't a single course that dealt with race, including my course on political theories of feminism. There wasn't a single professor of color. The first two professors of color taught courses on women in the emerging, and it was called the Chicano studies. Chicano was the word that we used in the 60s. Today, I think people would use the word Latinx. So that was quite surprising to me. And I wrote to a colleague of mine, you may have heard of her, Mary Rothschild. And Mary Rothschild and I were in the same history department, and she wrote a book on women in the civil rights movement. And she taught a course, and there was nothing by women. And what really struck me was we all had read everything we could find by Black women. We had read Maya Angelou, we had read, we were all supportive of Angela Davis's. I mean, we knew what little literature existed, yet we didn't put it in our syllabus. And that is a real failing, and I point that out in the book. And then the other failing was, which I talk about, which also deals with race, because I wanted to be very self-reflective about it, is in our struggle for reproductive justice. And one of the women named Nina Harding was one of the leaders of that struggle. She was an African-American woman. But both in terms of the more mainstream people who fought for women's liberation, as well as we left-wing activists, we did not deal with the question of race. And I think part of it we didn't really know how. And I think the other part was at this particular moment in time, the Black nationalist movement was very male dominated. And the belief was that birth control, a dominant belief, and it's held in some parts today too, was that birth control and abortion was genocide of people of color. And we didn't know how to address it. And even Nina Harding didn't really address it either. And that was a failing. And our struggle, and it was the first place where abortion, people got to vote on abortion, ever in the world, unless people voted before there was the written word, was in Washington State in 1970. And our major differences, the people who sort of voted against it, were largely in the Black community. But can I read the thing about Fannie Lou Hamer? I think I write it better than I would say it. We also, I mean, I wrote this in the book and I remember it at the time, but we also especially those of us who were white and from the North, learned something very important about uh, the necessity, the importance of not keeping the struggle for abortion rights totally localized on abortion. And the issue of forced sterilization was taken up in earnest by Women's Liberation Seattle. That was our group. Two events were catalysts. In February 1969, our local Peace and Freedom Party brought Fannie Lou Hamer, the legendary activist of the Black freedom struggle, to speak at the University of Washington. First, a member of Women's Liberation spoke about the abortion campaign. It was me. I wanted to put myself in the book in bold, but the editors didn't like it, so I lost out to the editors. Never trust an editor. First, a member of Hamer commented that the presentation was very interesting. She went on to say that she had never really thought much about the issues raised, but she thought she opposed abortion. She then told us about a time when she had been beaten by the police so severely that she had to be hospitalized. After her release, and much later, she found out that she had been sterilized against her wishes. The entire audience, overwhelmingly white, gasped, including me. The predominantly white audience had never learned about the coercive sterilization of African American women, even though the practice was so prevalent that it was referred to as the Mississippi appendectomy. And I've given this talk a few times, and quite often I say, when I was asked to speak with Mrs. Hamer, I should have had the good sense to say, no, Mrs. Hamer should have the entire floor. I hadn't earned the right. And one of my colleagues and sisters and friends said, but Barbara, if you hadn't spoken, she may not have educated an audience about coercive sterilization. And so I cherish that moment because it shows why it may take one person typing in the machine. It really takes a village of supporters to help you finish your book. And the other thing that happened to our group around coercive sterilization is one of our members, who was white, involved in a relationship with an African-American man, had one child, and then got pregnant. And this was after abortion had been legalized in Washington State. And she went to the main public hospital to get an abortion. And they told her that she had screwed up her life, but she was a candidate for abortion because she clearly didn't know how to handle herself, and she could only get an abortion if she agreed to be sterilized. Now, Teresa was poor. She wanted to stay in college. She was studying to become I forget the non-gendered name that we used to call draftsman. Maybe some of you could help me. I know it's in my book. And she had to support her child, so she agreed to be sterilized. And she came back to our group and told us about the story. And she said she felt she had been raped. And so a number of the members of our group went to the hospital, and we found out how pervasive the sterilization of working class Latinas and Black women was. And again, here's some local stuff. When I was in a group in Cleveland, we had 3 members in our group who were nurses, and they checked the records of the hospital in Cleveland Hospital. They found out that there was sterilization going on all the time. So that's why local history, local research, local activism is so important.
Well, on that subject, right, as you point out in the introduction, right, so much of the literature on the sort of women's liberation, radical feminism, really concentrates on the East Coast.
Yes.
So what do we see differently by focusing on Seattle?
I think it's not just Seattle. I think if you focus on Seattle or Austin or Minneapolis or Brooklyn or even rural communities, I think you will find that much of the misogynist mythology should be discarded.
Explain that. Maybe
well, the idea that the women's liberation movement, we were selfish, we were divisive, we were, on the one hand, some critics say we were anti-lesbian, other critics say we all were a bunch of dykes, some critics say we didn't care about wives, mothers, and children. When our group got started in 1968, there was only one member who had a child, and our first activity was around daycare. So younger childless women knew already, and I think it had to do with reading left-wing books and articles about the family, but we thought daycare was essential. But I think we would learn about the depth and the breadth of local organizing, the different issues that were taken up, how also alliances and coalitions were created. The 6 groups I write about were overwhelmingly white, but not all white. Yet we made very meaningful coalitions with women in the Black Panthers, the Domestic Workers of America. There was a very important strike that took place in Texas, Willie Farah. You have to be my age or older to remember it, or maybe a student of yours, or Prudence's. But one of our members had worked for Willie Farah. And so we were able to make coalitions with Latinas who had been garment workers. We brought back International Women's Day, and it was truly international. So I think you would find that there was more of that in so many local areas. And I think one of the reasons that, if I do it alphabetically, Boston, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. were written about all the time is that they were major financial, academic, media, and political centers. Believe it or not, at one point, Seattle was viewed as a backwater. Today, try to get to afford a house there. It's not anymore. But so I think that we need a lot more local histories. And I think also by focusing on the local, could you imagine having a history of Baltimore women's liberation activities, or Gary, or Cleveland, or cities that have a significant and larger population of people of color? We would learn so much.
Right. So in many ways, you introduce us to a whole different cast of like feminist activists and heroines. So tell us about one of them.
Well, I'll begin with Nina Harding, as you know I would, because the book is dedicated to Nina, and I have a picture of her. Anybody in this audience ever met Audre Lorde? I have. She taught at Hunter when I adjuncted Hunter, and she was a wonderful, brilliant colleague, writer, sister, warrior, and she scared the pants off me. I worked with her on a number of classes. Nina Harding was an African-American woman from a middle-class background, and she moved to Seattle, and she writes about her experience getting an abortion. I couldn't get the pictures ready, but it's in the book. And she writes about it. And I wrote her unhappy marriage, unreliable contraception, illegal abortion helped bring her into the radical feminist politics. Her harrowing experience was indicative of what Black and working class women had experienced while trying to get an abortion. And she tells the story and how she finally is directed to one doctor who won't perform procedures on Black women or working class women. And finally, when we have our first big abortion legalization, a demonstration to legalize abortion, we're making posters, and she shows up with a coat hanger. And she put the coat hanger on the poster. And the woman who was the leader of Seattle Radical Women thought this was it wasn't in good taste. And Nina said, too bad, because in those days, women did use crochet hooks, and they did use coat hangers. And she thinks, and there's no way we can prove it, but she's the first person to use the coat hanger. And if you look at abortion, pro-choice, or reproductive justice buttons, quite often you'll see a coat hanger. It will say never again, or there'll be the coat hanger with the red slash through it. She continued very active in Radical Women. She wrote what I consider to be a very important position paper on feminism and socialism. She helped form a number of African American and women of color groups at the University of Washington. She left Seattle, I think, in 73, 74, got a law degree in Indianapolis, and came back to Seattle and was very active in the African American community, especially around the issue of breast cancer. And she unfortunately died of breast cancer, but I got to interview her and reacquaint myself with her before she passed. She's a really extraordinary person.
I mean, one of the things you're also doing, and we were lucky enough last year, as you know, to have Barbara Smith as the Hess Scholar. is really centering and recentering, right, socialist feminism. And kind of moving us away from kind of ideas of the women's movement that are, as you say, sometimes dominated by bourgeois women with only certain issues focused on, to a much broader array of issues. So tell us a little more about that. Like,
the first three women's liberation groups in Seattle, the first one that was formed October 67 was Seattle Radical Women. And it was a group of Trotskyist women. I'm sure many of you wouldn't know the difference between a Trotskyist and, you know, a turkey trot, but it was a particular faction within the international small c communist movement, and most Trotskyists were hated and despised for lots of complicated reasons. And they were in, when I say a small Trotskyist group, I mean there were like 8 of them. And they, one of the women who, named Clara Fraser, had been in the Young People's Socialist League, and then she joined this group called the Socialist Workers' Party. She became a leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, and then she broke away from the Socialist Workers' Party because they weren't strong enough on women's issues. In those days, it was called the woman question. I don't know why we were always a question. Sometimes scholars about 20 years ago said, we have to problematize women. I said, I didn't realize we were the problem, you know. So Seattle is somewhat unique in that it was a group of Trotskyist women who founded Seattle Radical Women, and a group of Trotskyist women who founded the other group called Women's Liberation Seattle. And it was a very gutsy thing to do because Seattle was just recovering from McCarthyism, and we had our own branch of McCarthyism. The administrator who kicked us, a bunch of us, out of school the first time, we later found out he had been the leader of the Washington State HUAC. And that was very helpful in exposing him. But the rest of us who weren't in organizations, most of us saw ourselves, whatever it meant at the time, as socialists, as revolutionaries. We hated the system. And by hating the system, what we did is we hated U.S. imperialism, we opposed the war in Vietnam, we hated racism, we opposed the way in which the police and the state treated African Americans and Latinos. We supported union rights like the farm workers. There was even a group, again, the language of the 60s, it was called Indian Fishing Rights, which supported the rights of our indigenous community to fish in the lakes and rivers in Washington State. We even had Marlon Brando come and protest with us. So we were all involved in this. And in a sense, before Kimberly Crenshaw defined the word intersectional, we were involved in what you all now know as intersectional politics. And I think it was because we were lefties. We were various sorts. And in those days, there were Maoists, people who supported the ideas of Mao Zedong, Guevarists, people who liked Che Guevara, people who liked Ho Chi Minh. Sort of anybody who opposed U.S. imperialism, we tended to like. And there weren't that many women leaders then. But there was Madame Binh from the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. And this is another, all these interesting anecdotes. When the United States sent its delegation to meet with the Vietnamese delegation, the U.S. delegation was all white and all male. And the leadership of the leader of the Vietnamese delegation was a woman by the name of Madame Binh. So, it wasn't lost on us that the Vietnamese at least had greater respect for women than our own government.
So for me, teaching at Brooklyn College changes the way I write about the Black freedom struggle. It changes the questions I ask. It changes what I pay attention to. It changes how I see the kind of dangers of the myths that surround the civil rights movement. So how did teaching at Brooklyn College change how you wrote this book?
Well, I wrote it during the pandemic, so, but I would say 2 colleges really changed the way I think I taught in general, and I write. One was I taught for 4 years at Medgar Evers College, and that was a wonderful, challenging experience for me, and then here at Brooklyn College. And, we faculty, we love the enormous high pay we get and the wonderful working conditions and, you know, the easy teaching load. I joke about that, but what keeps us here until we have to retire are the students. There's no question about it. And what is so great about teaching at Brooklyn College is this, you know, it's not, our students are not even binary. You know, they're from so many different backgrounds. So you have to, as a professor, and especially because I'm older, meaning I came out of, as you heard, an experience of only having old white men teach me a certain kind of history. So in a sense, I had to learn how to teach and write history from my students who fortunately were not old white men.
Right, right. What was one of the hardest things about writing the book?
There were two phases that were hard. The first phase was getting out of my head that the women's liberation movement was white and racist. When I first started thinking about it and talking to people, I would talk to people and say, oh, I'm writing a book about the women's liberation movement. Well, I hope you write about how racist it was. And again, it was more complicated than just being how racist it was. And it was many, many years and many conversations with leading African-American scholars who you know and have worked with, like Beverly Guy Sheftel, who read the manuscript, like Barbara Ransby, who helped me work through this and understand myself and my writing better. And then the other hard part was getting myself out of the book. You know, the early question you asked, what did you find about yourself that you didn't know? And I sort of was a little bit embarrassed because I was in the newspapers and in the writings a lot more than I remembered to be. And my original draft, I wanted to include more of myself, my personal reflections to things. And as I said, the editors didn't like it, but I had to keep myself out of it. And another way to answer this is when I was learning how to write history, it was sort of, your old white men just said, you must be objective, you know, you can be objective. You know, you write that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's an objective fact. I don't know if the ocean is blue, but that's beside the point. Today, if you teach history and if you mentor students in history, you really do ask people to interrogate their own biases, where they come from, what are they thinking about. Not so that your teaching is objective, but that you understand where you came from and where you're coming from. To make sure that what you write is as truthful as you can possibly be, recognizing who you are.
Right. So I think this is going to be my last question, and then we can open it up. So, I mean, also part of why I write history is because I think it helps us see the present more clearly. So I guess where I want us to go now is like, how do you think this history helps us see where we are today, where we need to go from here? Like, what lessons does it give us for today?
Well, when I was interviewed by someone else and I was talking about all our accomplishments and I could recite them, then she said, aren't you profoundly depressed at where we are now? And I said, yes. So one thing people can get from looking at a book like this is what we actually accomplished in a very short period of time. Number two, and I can't stress this enough, and I hope it comes through, is we accomplished what we accomplished not by looking at the Supreme Court. I know somebody's going to be talking about the Supreme Court, but my new slogan is stop talking about the law and start breaking it. We didn't rely on the courts, we didn't rely on Congress, and we didn't rely on national organizations. We looked toward local grassroots activist work, and I hope that's something people get out of it. And if somebody wants, my opinion, I think it needs to happen again, and I think it is in many places. We're facing a far more existential crisis than my generation did, even though my generation, you know, the young men, you know, all thought for at one point they were going to have to go and fight a war they didn't want to, and there was a greater chance you would be drafted if you were Black or Latino. If you were Trump or Bush or Clinton, you could get out of the draft, but not if you were a student at Brooklyn College, for example. And but it's nothing compared to what we're going through today. So I think the issue of struggle is very important. And may I just read my last paragraph?
Yes,
Because
please.
I like it. The years since the enormous pink pussy hat demonstrations, any of you on them beside me? I'm sure many of you were. Raise your hand, come on. The right after Bush got elected. My granddaughter's getting my pink pussy hat. The years since the enormous pink pussy hat demonstrations by global and intersectional feminist activists have only highlighted the imperative of radical visions of women's liberation. I had used the past tense, but I will put this in the present. We are experiencing a global pandemic, a racial crisis over state violence, a breakdown in political norms from the grassroots to the US presidency. And you can see that this book is dated because I said a war in Europe, and now we have a genocidal war in the Middle East that may engulf the entire world. Yet many of the strategies and tactics we employed in Seattle in the late 1960s and 70s give us a glimmer of hope. Women of color now lead interracial, mixed gender, and cross-class coalitions. They are calling for massive mobilizations to protect the planet, to fight for the right to vote, to get an education, to migrate or find refuge from violence, to healthcare and daycare, to promote gun safety, to call for a living wage, peace, and an end to murderous policing. The struggle continues.
Comments, questions, thoughts, reflections?
I'll show you a picture that will make you all laugh. We'll pass it around. You know which one it is. If you go to page
Was it hard to get them to let
page
you
2
have,
and page 3.
have
Page 2.
pictures?
I was only allowed 12
You're only allowed 12.
and the map. So just very quickly, I begin the book with my wedding picture. I wanted to show you a visual. This is before women's liberation. And 2 months later. 2 months later. You know how all the People magazines, they do the before and after? This is what I call before and after. There are a lot more pictures. It's very hard to get pictures in books
Yeah,
these days because
totally.
it's so expensive. And
Yep.
oops.
That was very.
So I was very lucky, although I had about 20 that I. And another thing which I do beg activists to do is save your materials and give them to the archives. Right, archivists? Because I would hope in 50 years somebody goes through an archive and goes, my God, look what they did then. Maybe we could do something like that now. I found out by just going through in such detail that the person who founded the Washington State NAACP was a Black woman. Who knew? You know, I mean, somebody should write a biography of her. So save your materials. I have 4 boxes of materials that are in the University of Washington archive. You guys get mine. Oh, come on.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sunja, yeah.
I'll ask a question just to start us
I
off.
think Kiana's going to bring you
Thanks,
the.
Barbara. That was fascinating. So, for young people who need to start organizing with fervor again, what possibilities do you think new information technologies hold as tools for organizing? I mean, the perils and promise of social media. And when I say organizing, I mean organizing across the boundaries of nation states. Right? I mean, that's...
I think you asked the wrong person that question. I think it's better to ask somebody who's using it much more, as opposed to, I mean, I think they're extraordinary possibilities, and then I assume they're very difficult possibilities. I mean, I talked to my daughter Samantha, who is a union organizer. She's in Portland right now organizing the teachers who are out on strike. And, you know, she has all these gadgets in front of her and manages to talk to people all over and get out information in a way I never could. I'm afraid I stopped using all that for organizing. Even a name some of you know, Nancy Romer. You know, I'd say, let's ask Nancy, but I think she would give a very similar answer. Ask somebody who's under 40, because they're the ones, the activists who know, who know really how to use it and use it for something good, and also how to discern what's BS and what's trolling lies and so forth, and also what not to click on so that you don't get spammed or that your machine doesn't collapse. I mean, those are things Samantha tells me all the time. Don't do that, you know. And so I would ask somebody who's active and who's much younger.
I have a question about
more like a reflection on moments of difficulties. And I mean, like, I think that this year, Brooklyn College is both depressing and exciting. And I think that we got a lot of problems, but also, at least from my point of view, a lot of times that when things get really bad, people will stand up to fight. And so you have a lot of organizing going on across the campus on different issues, right? And I think that one thing that it really struck me as also an older person, and begin to feel that is really sort of like a generational difference, is that when we organize, we obviously have our eyes on the prize, but our eyes is also not always on the prize. We always look at the bigger pictures. And so what we ask is not necessarily what we get at the end, we still keep going, right? But for young people, I think that one of the challenges is that when the focus is on the prize and when the prize is not accessible, then it turns into desperation and demoralization. And so I've been thinking about these questions a lot, is that how we can actually sustain a movement. I mean, the Brooklyn College, as local as it can be, that how can we sustain localized movement at Brooklyn College and knowing that the desperation and demoralization, it is part of the elements. And so I would assume that you have experienced that in your organizing life. So how would you, what kind of feedback and reflection did you have?
Other people would speak to that too. You start. Well, first of all, at a college and university, the students do leave at some point. I mean, I had a friend who was 21 years trying to get his BA, but I think he just couldn't bear leaving university. But most of us get out. And so the question is, whatever kind of groups we're involved in, do we create an infrastructure so that it will continue, or will the next group, cohort of students create it? When I came to Brooklyn College, we had a welfare rights, there was a welfare rights group that was connected with the Women's Center. There was a pro-choice group, and there have been different groups that have come and gone. In a sense, the folks, I think, who can hopefully mentor are, of course, the faculty and the sympathetic people like yourselves, the sympathetic administrators. I think one of the things that we learned, you know, we revolutionaries working in the abortion and in the daycare campaign, we learned a lesson of how you work with people with whom you have substantive disagreements. Is the disagreement worth the struggle? So I'll give an example with daycare. It was a campus with maybe 100,000 people, 35,000 students, and we demanded free childcare for all children, faculty, staff, administration, and students. It had to be 50% men. In those days we were binary, 50% men and 50% women. It had to be a certain percentage people of color. There had to be non-sexist education. I mean, it was and it had to be free. Now, looking back, I have to chuckle. You know, it's very difficult for something that big to create free, you know, I'm all for it. I think there should be free funded childcare. Try to get it ever to be 50% staffed by men, but that's another story. So we had to learn to negotiate. And we also learned in our struggle that in spite of our fervent, you know, feminism, um, that didn't win the battles, and that the administration was stronger. They had the press behind them, and so we had to learn how to negotiate and also keep your principles intact. The same thing was true with the abortion rights movement. The bill that finally was introduced was to legalize abortion, but the first bill that was introduced, it had a residency requirement and I think husband's consent. And our group, Women's Liberation Seattle, we said, we oppose this, and we spoke about what we opposed, and we had to debate people who give, you know, the argument, you know, you can't get the perfect, you know, sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the greater good. But what we were able to do was to keep the issue of there shouldn't be a residency requirement, you shouldn't have to have parental and marital consent, but we still said you should vote for the bill, but keep raising those issues. And I think those are lessons you learn in struggle. And sometimes you don't learn it until it's too late and you learn it the wrong way. There was a faction within the Students for a Democratic Society who became so angry and so frustrated at the ongoing war and the ongoing repression against African Americans that they became the weathermen, and they thought the solution was to blow up buildings. And they didn't accomplish much. And one of their strongest adherents, who I knew, Kathy Boudin, she goes to jail for participating in an armed robbery in which I don't think he was a police officer. I think it was like a Brinks driver was killed. Kathy did more good for women and women of color, I hate to say this, in Bedford Hills and out of Bedford Hills than she ever did in SDS. So sometimes just it goes the, you know, people get so frustrated that they resort to tactics and strategies that just hurt the movement. In many cases, it doesn't happen. You just learn how to negotiate and keep your principles. And many of us who were active in Seattle ended up founding the first rape crisis clinic, the first battered women's shelter, a divorce co-op, women in gender studies at the University of Washington and at Seattle Community College, expanded healthcare. And many of the women who I've interviewed, and I write about them in the book, they've continued their activism. You know, maybe, you know, they got burnt out after 5 years of going to nothing but meetings, and then took a break, got a job, maybe had a family or something, but they went on to become activists, and most of them have stayed lifelong activists. So maybe a book like that, and some of you who are older, who are still in the struggle, can say, you know, don't totally burn yourself out when you're 22. Because we need you when you're 87. I'm not 87 yet.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
What took you from the picture of the lovely bride to the protester?
Well, I actually was a very rebellious young woman. My mother insisted I have a.
Oh, you were already there.
Yeah, I was already there, but. And the reason I got married, the man I married and I, we didn't believe in marriage, but we wanted to sleep together and we didn't want our parents screaming at us. So we got married in 1967. By 1970, if we had waited 3 more years, which we didn't want to, you know, we could have lived together and they would have accepted it. You know, I don't know the answer to that. I think whatever it was in my psyche, I was always rebellious. I lived in a town that had restrictive real estate covenants against Jews, against Catholics, against African Americans. At one point, believe it or not, Harry Belafonte wanted to move into our town, and the city zoning board said they would rezone the town so he wouldn't live in it. And he would have lived on the end of our street. Could you imagine having somebody like Harry Belafonte as a neighbor? I mean, so I chafed against that. I mean, I don't know why, you know, who knows what it was in my makeup, but I always was rebellious. And in high school, I used to cut classes and go and picket at Woolworths. And some of you may know the name Anne Snitow, very famous literary writer. She died about 5 years ago. She was from the same town, and what's interesting is her parents were very left of center. My parents, my mother was called a Rockefeller Republican, a moderate Republican. They only exist in museums now. They've been defunct for a while. And my father was a New Deal Democrat. But the four of them worked together because they were going to ban books in my town's library, and my parents and Anne's parents. So I got a little bit of it from them as well.
How long's changed?
Well, they don't ban books in that library anymore, but they don't go to Tennessee. So I who knows what the reasons were.
Okay.
You said you wanted to talk about the Women's Center.
Oh, I was just going to say, I thought I did it when I said about South Fong. Just make sure, all of you, that this Women's Center thrives, flourishes, gets funded. And if you need to call in outside help, a lot of us are very willing to join with you. So, should we do the present now?
Sure.
So,
Oh, sorry, Prudence.
No.
Professor Cumberbatch.
my duties. So I'm going to call up Colleen Bradley Saunders and Barbara, because Barbara has a gift to the archive.
While you're talking, I'll try to unwrap.
Oh, am I supposed to talk? Okay.
I don't know what you're supposed to do.
Oh, I'm not going to say much. I'm Colleen Bradley Sanders. I'm the head of the Archives and Special Collections here at Brooklyn College. And Barbara has been a good friend to the Archives for many years, and she helped us acquire our children's collection we have in the Archives. And some of you may or may not know this. We are open to all of you. You are welcome to come to the Archives and do research. We're happy to help you find things that you're interested in. We collect, Brooklyn College history, and that includes famous women like Shirley. But we also have some Brooklyn history materials. And so Barbara is gifting us a portrait of Shirley Chisholm that will be hanging in the archives as soon as we can get some help hanging it up. And so we're very happy about that. I haven't seen this yet.
Now, Colleen's been very modest. I went to visit the archives because the emerita and retired faculty need to downsize, and Brooklyn College is very happy to take a lot of our materials. And when I was looking at the archives, they were pointing out that when you walk into the archive, there are only images of white men who are boxers. Now, I have nothing against boxing. It's too bad it's not Muhammad Ali, but whatever. And so Colleen and Marianne were talking and saying, we don't have enough women. So my cousin gave me a woodcut of Shirley Chisholm, and it's big, and I don't have any room in my apartment for it, so I want to give it to Brooklyn College, to the archives. I mean, I think it's really beautiful. It's really. And it's a gift and a loan, because if and when I ever leave the planet, I'm not planning to, if either one of my daughters or my grandchildren want it, but I don't think you need to worry for quite a while. So, and I think it's really terrific, and it's a lot better than a boxer. We're also, you remember better than I do, there's a graduate of Brooklyn College. She's now 104 years old.
108.
108 now.
108.
I met her last summer. She lives in Martha's Vineyard, and she was an she's African American, an activist. She was in the Southern Negro Workers League or something like that.
SNYC.
SN
She was a leader with another Brooklyn College graduate woman as well.
Yes.
They were both leaders in this.
And they were best friends.
They were
too.
best friends. Their husbands got along, and they were leaders. They were trying to get the Communist Party in the South to have, more gender equality.
Gender and racial equality.
Yeah, gender, and they were big communists at Brooklyn College.
Yes, and their kids, you know their kids. One of them's a labor activist, and the other's a judge. And she's an artist as well. And I went to visit her, and I've been trying. They don't answer the phone anymore. I hope it's not for reasons we think, but at 108, who knows? But I'm trying to convince her daughters that if she has any papers left, to give them to Brooklyn College. And Marianne raised the possibility of maybe buying one of her paintings. That would go very nicely in the archives. So if any of you are students, you might want to look into the radical history of Brooklyn College. It's really very exciting. And there were a number of groups that advocated for racial justice. And Shirley Chisholm got her start. I remember she said, "How can you ever be like Shirley Chisholm?" I said, "She got her start, as a student activist." So, and now she'll be with us for quite a while.
Yes. And Archives at Brooklyn College, thank you, Barbara.
Well, I want to thank Barbara for coming today, and thank you, Jeanne, for participating, and thank you all for coming. Professor Winslow has some books. She will be selling and signing them after the event, so feel free to come, ask questions, say hello, grab a book, and thank you for coming to this event organized by the Wolf Institute. And don't forget, next Thursday, Melissa Murray will be speaking here at 12:30 as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. What are you working on? I was told you were doing
a book on Martin Luther King